right, ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very special guest. We have Josh Fegan, the real estate coach of Australia, you could say. Josh is a proud supporter of ours and vice versa. Also a customer, if I don't mind saying.
That's true, yeah.
We thought Josh would be a fantastic person to come on board, have a chat about not only what he's personally seeing across Australia and in terms of the effects on the consumers and real estate agents and their businesses, but personally, what he's seeing is changing in the end-to-end transaction for the consumer from the current state of the economy. So, Josh, great to have you on board.
Theo, great to be here. I've listened to many and watched plenty, so fantastic to finally be on the show.
No worries. I think you're actually one of the people that inspired us to start a podcast because your podcast has gone viral across Australia with obviously fellow number one real estate agent of Australia, Alex Phillips, that is.
Yeah, sure.
Who was a previous guest. So we've covered a lot of stuff in this podcast about, interest rates and inflation and the global economy and what's going on. And I'm mindful that we don't sort of repeat ourselves on certain topics. However, a lot has changed in the last sort of few weeks or couple of months, I should say. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's a change in sentiment to my point about what you probably are seeing across Australia. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, where are you sort of working? Is it just the East Coast?
So we work all the way across Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and the UAE.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Okay. So you're seeing global sort of activity. And well, let's start with that. What are you seeing?
So I think that the most important part is to actually always understand, and as you well know, that markets actually work in cycles, right? And when you go to have a look at those cycles, we tend to have a look at it. Heron Todd White, the valuers, put out a graph: peak of market cycle, declining market, bottom of market cycle, rising market. And that graph usually takes about 7 or 8 years to go through the cycle. And that's gone through so fast, So ScoMo getting elected, we were probably getting close to the bottom of the market cycle. There was a lot of fear mongering at the time of the proposed changes that the potential Labor government was going to make at that stage, negative gearing and a whole range of conversations. ScoMo got elected. It felt like the next weekend there was a lot of positivity came back into the market very quickly. And that then literally drove where the market continued to kind of grow a little bit, and then we kind of got just to the edge of the precipice of that February of 2020, and that then hit obviously with the pandemic. CBA comes out, says we're a minimum probably 30% decline in property prices. We go through a very nerve-wracking March, April, May period where we're all wondering if we're going to have jobs or whether or not our businesses are going to exist. And then all of a sudden there's a huge amount of government protection measures that come in to support the economy. All of a sudden we go through a declining market into the bottom of market cycle and right up into a rising market in what feels like a couple of weeks. And we stay in that rising market area for like a good 2 years. And like literally some phenomenal price increases. Now, if you have a look at it, Byron Bay goes up 80% as an example. Some sections here in Sydney up on, for example, Palm Beach, that sort of stuff could go up 40, 50, 60% at any one point in time. And what was actually amazing was just to watch how quickly that came.
And both those markets at certain points for like a decade didn't really move, right?
When I first started training in residential real estate, I was really coming through the crux of the 08-09 financial crisis. And they sent me to go and do a training event over in Avalon, and I was like, what is wrong with the people here? Because everyone was so negative about what was going on, and I didn't realise that it was one of the very early weather vanes of whenever markets actually substantially tumble. Holiday home type markets and discretionary homes are the ones that ultimately take the hit first, and inner city ring is the one that goes first and then literally then recovers the quickest. And so I was always taught that like Paddington in Sydney is kind of the weather vane of what's going to be happening in the rest of the Australian market. It moves very quickly. It then follows to Balmain about 4 or 5 weeks later. Balmain then goes to Manly 4 or 5 weeks later, and then about 4 or 5 weeks after that it hits DY, Collaroy right the way up. Now, once it's hit Sydney, it's usually about 3 to 6 months before then it then goes to Melbourne, and then it's about another 3 to 6 months before that then climbs into Brisbane. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of watch how that goes. And in tracking this and being involved with it for a number of years, what I've worked out very quickly is that people don't really think about what actually drives market sentiment. Now, those drivers are very simple things that you would be aware of. government policy changes. Are they positive towards the market or not? Population growth, what's actually happening there? Employment, what's happening in that section of the environment? What are we actually doing in terms of new supply of what's actually being built and in marketplace today? Follow that by, some other things that are happening by international governments and what their policies may well be, can all of a sudden change the Australian market very, very quickly. One of my favourites of all time is that there's actually a curve like this that AMP Capital Markets actually put out, and more than happy to get you a copy of that so we can put it on the screen for the guys. But the basic idea is you go from a period of optimism and you get to this whole level of excitement and you get to kind of thrill, and then you kind of get to this point of euphoria in a market cycle. And that's where there's maximum return on the investment when you go to sell it, and everyone feels like they're a legend. Usually you'll see a lot of real estate agents posting on their social media, sold for $200,000 above reserve, #strategy.
Street record.
Yeah, that sort of stuff, right? And then what actually happens is that then all of a sudden there's a policy shift. Now in Australia, really tiny movements like APRA shifting from 2.5 to 3% in terms of the buffer of the assessment rate. Like that little movement, like literally 90 days later, that then starts to impact on how much people can borrow. That then all of a sudden starts to get a bit of a mood and change. People don't realise it yet. It just kind of, maybe it's just a Christmas period, we'll just see what happens. And then by January, February, the things moved again. Then what actually happens, you go down to this capitulation and fear and despondency, followed closely by depression in terms of market cycles. And at the bottom of that depression cycle, that's the opportunistic time to go to buy. And once the market kind of feels depressed, then all of a sudden, then you get ready for the recovery.
So are you alluding to the fact that we might be in that?
Oh, we're already there.
Yeah, we're already there.
There is no doubt whatsoever that and there's a big difference between a boom and a recovery, right? So a boom is a very, very aggressive period of time where all of a sudden you go from one weekend of not many people turning up at an open house to the following weekend, 35 people are lined up out the front, and you're wondering if you got the time wrong on the major real estate websites.
Which is exactly what we saw on COVID, right?
Yeah, exactly right. So what you start to have a look at is that there are some things that are hitting, and I say to people, get ready for the recovery. So from my layman's terms, I would tend to say that we're at a position that we're getting closer to the top of the interest rate hiking cycle. We're therefore probably getting closer to the bottom of the property pricing cycle, and naturally we're starting to see significant increases in rent, which is actually a natural time for people to be buying an asset, because last time I checked, investors actually make money in two ways. The first way that they make it is through rental return, which is starting to be on the improve, and the secondary way that they make it is through capital growth. So if you're buying an asset, not just purely for rental return, but also for capital growth, then one would suggest that buying now is probably one of the better times to be entering into the market cycle.
So you said there's a few signals that indicate we're in that recovery stage. Are they the signals, or are you looking at some data with, I know CoreLogic came out for March with sort of the first month of growth nationally in 12 months?
Yeah, so they've called it. A guy by the name of Louis Christopher from SQM Research has also called it as well. There's about 4 majors that actually have all called it in the last few weeks that said, hey, we're definitely into the position of recovery and we're no longer into the slide or the decline. Now that's for Sydney and Melbourne Metro. Obviously, there are other markets that are yet to experience what we're going through. We're certainly not through the final parts of the decline. There'll be certain markets that will still face that, there is no doubt. It's not a case that, hey, Theo, put your property on the market today and you'll make an extra $100,000. But what it is definitely a case of is that, if you sell it today and in 30 days' time we take it back to market, we'll probably sell it for a similar number. Whereas, as opposed to $100,000 less, or in a boom condition, $100,000 more. Now, this is a really important thing for people to get aware of, is that, don't get too excited. A recovery is very different from a boom. This is what I'm going to call a very slow recovery. Outside of a really significant, major shock event in a global sphere, we're actually in a position that the government has to actually tighten the amount of cash that's in society. And so, and I think I heard a number that was like 30% extra cash in the global environment that was pumped in during the COVID era. Now, ultimately, in 2020, 21, 22, all you had to do is walk outside and catch the money. Like that's a lot of businesses, and whether or not it was government incentives or the amount of money. Like, how many of your friends bought a jet ski, a boat, a car, an extra house, all of this sort of stuff.
New TV, something.
Yeah, and that is a really interesting phase, because now it's actually not the case. So whilst you go through a cost of living crisis, the reality of it is that what we know is, from a consumer point of view, we've all tightened our belts. We're now starting to think, well, will I buy that? Or actually, no, I'll just wait until my birthday. I'll still buy it, but I'll buy it on my birthday, or I'll buy it at Christmas, as opposed to just discretionary spend everywhere. Now, the big drivers, Dr. Jim Chalmers, our current treasurer in Australia, came out and said, hey, sorry guys, I got it wrong. I thought there was 250,000 people coming to Australia. Turns out there's 350,000 people. Guys, by the way, China's made a slight change in relation to going to university. If you want your degree to actually be recognised, you actually need to do that in face-to-face learning. And 30,000 Chinese students turned up on the shores of Australian universities in literally a 2-week period.
So hold on, you're touching on some great points here, Josh. I think we need to step it back and just open up some of those topics a bit more. So, some of these comments I feel like getting misconstrued publicly in the media or online and whatnot. For being either bad news or good news. So let's talk about the 350,000 migrants. Isn't that good news?
So the answer to that is absolutely yes. Because, we do a lot of work in Dubai, and in Dubai they have a philosophy which is if it's good for business, it's good for Dubai. The Australian psyche doesn't necessarily share that same philosophy. If you have a look at Dr. Jim Chalmers' report that came out, there's like an essay of about 4,000 words or so. His opinion is that without a doubt that the government must be involved in regulating and involved in every part of society, particularly in business, which is what I go to call government interference. Now, if you're interested in free markets, where I tend to lean in terms of my policy settings, is that I believe that if it is good business, if it is good for business, it will be good for society, because society needs businesses that it can actually find opportunity and go and do something with it to serve customers in new and better ways. Now, the government definitely plays a role in terms of protecting the vulnerable, but the challenge is that with Australia, we've got an ageing population. So if you have an ageing population, as my dad would call it, those that are closer to the sunset than the sunrise, the interesting conversation is that they've got a lot of money and not much time. And so if they're going to go to the golf clubs and be there and have lunch and all of the above, who's going to serve them? Who's the chef out the back? Who are the people doing front of house service? What are the things that are happening there? Secondary conversation, all of the services that are associated in serving, the baby boomer generation, what's that, 1950s in that era. What does that actually look like? So you've got a policy setting where the number of people that are voting are going to be voting for policies that are not about taxes in relation to wages.
No, it's about them.
And then you've then got a number of people that are saying, hey, hang on a second, I'm out here working. How come my vote doesn't actually count? And I saw a great comment in the Australian Financial Review, Australia underpopulated, overtaxed and overregulated. And it's absolutely true, because if you go and you have a look at the Dubai 2040 plan, how's this for a vision for a country where they're saying, hey, we want to go from 3 million to 6 million people. We want to increase public beaches by 438%. We want to increase commercial activity by 168 square kilometres. We want to increase what's actually happening in terms of public beaches by private beaches by 138%. Increase all of their tourism traffic and activities by another 138%. And there's 10, you get the idea, green corridors, you name it. I searched for the Sydney 2040 plan.
How do you remember all these facts and figures?
You're
like a Bible of this information.
But I looked at it and I tried to find the Australia 2040 plan. I didn't come up with much. Right now, we're still arguing if we can get a train or a bus out to the new airport. And the new airport that's being built here in Sydney is half the size of the current Adelaide airport. So either the planners know something that I don't know, or Australia completely lacks a ton of vision. Now, the reality of it is, and you'll see both sides of politics are grappling with these issues, most politicians in Australia only ever look at demand side equation as opposed to supply side, because supply side is multi-generational, 5-year, 10-year, 25-year planning. It's about infrastructure. It's about decentralisation. It's about you don't have to live in Sydney to have a good life. How do we have another inland city? Like all of those types of things. And if you don't have and regardless of your political persuasion, it would be lovely to have a country where at least there's a bit of a rough plan on some things that we overall all agree on as a country. And particularly when it comes to development. Where the problem is if 350,000 migrants turn up, where are they all going to live? So the rental crisis is here to stay.
Which is the hot topic, right? That's the good news being turned into bad news.
Absolutely.
It's the housing crisis in New South Wales in particular.
Yeah.
And
Victoria's the same.
Victoria's the same.
So you have a quick look at the stats that are coming out, and they're saying anywhere between 35, and I think the highest number I saw was close to 39% of all properties currently available for sale in Australia were previous investment properties. Now, why would that actually be the case? Well, why would you sell your investment property right now, Theo? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, interest is going up, so you've got a situation where you've got a higher expense mechanism. Governments are talking about rent caps. haven't done it yet, but are having conversations around what that might look like.
Governments are talking about changing discounts on capital gains tax.
What negative gearing is going to be a very expensive line item for the government this year, because as interest rates go up, obviously there's a larger amount of negative gearing benefits that they give out to the taxpayer. So those policy settings are all counter actually having growth in population. And so, like, if I'm an investor today and I want to go and buy another investment property, well, I'm probably going to get a return of, 3 or 4%. I'm in a position I'm probably paying 5.5. If I don't have a good mortgage broker, I'm probably paying 6.5.
Yep.
There's a plug for you. And then that then leads into a conversation, or then I've got some negative gearing, and then I've got the fear that interest rates are going to go up another 1 or 2 or 3%. Now, if you have a look at it, Canada, the USA, New Zealand right now, and the UK, Australia has a lower cash rate than all of the majors. So, Australians have got to realise we've got it really good.
We've got it good. So you were touching on foreign investment, some potential changes with money, sitting on the border and coming in. Are you referring to maybe a potential change in the FIRB sort of system? Because that framework, I believe, is a bit of a hindrance, right?
It's also got to do with the taxation rates. So if you invest in commercial, you have a lower taxation rate than if you invest in residential. So what they're saying is that, hey, that's not right, and we need to pull it back so that it's actually the same taxation rate for both industrial, commercial, and residential build-to-rent sectors. So, and it's bizarre that any of this stuff would exist, but that's exactly what's happening.
But is that you also saying that, internationally in these other markets, they do get these build-to-rent schemes up off the ground, up and running a lot quicker because of foreign investment, which they can't get here?
Yeah, exactly right. And so that's the important part, because everyone in Australia wants a particular return rate, versus capital is going, hang on a second, we can actually borrow it less in Australia, and we've got currency exchange plays and a whole range of other things in how we can actually make that really work.
So you're probably across that more than me. Are there actual changes, though, on the cards in discussion?
No. So the Property Council of Australia have come out and made a recommendation that the government looks at it as an area that it does need some policy realignment, and that there should be no penalty for someone internationally participating at a commercial and industrial level, versus if they were making the decision to put those funds into a residential project.
Because that would really help with supply, right?
Absolutely.
That would help with all these issues that we're talking about.
So if you're in a position that you want to build a new community or a new city, or you want to go and do those things, and just because it's a part of a build-to-rent sector, it doesn't mean that later on that might not be on-sold. And so that's actually a really important conversation. You can set some policy settings that for the first 5 years of the life of that product, it must be build-to-rent. And then after that, then it can actually then be on-sold. And that just encourages new supply to fix some of these issues around rental crisis.
Yeah. So you just touched on something there. I want to also just open up and elaborate a bit more. It is some of these policy changes and tax changes, you should say, to investors and landlords. They are counterintuitive to addressing the housing crisis, right? So negative gearing, it's been spoken about, but I think they came out recently saying they're not touching that. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's no touching of the negative gearing stuff.
But capital gains tax discounts, they've strategically and sneakily come out and said they won't touch capital gains tax exemptions, but they didn't really comment on the discounts. And a lot of people don't realise that there is even a discount on their primary residence, on shares, on anything that they do for investment purposes, which is a capital-intensive sort of outcome, or a capital gain, I should say, that there's actually a 50% discount, meaning that if there was no discount in place, they'd be paying income tax on the growth of their investment property, which is going to make people, to your point, if we need more houses in Victoria, more houses in New South Wales, who's going to be buying these houses to rent out as investment properties if you're going to be paying, let's say, 48 cents to the dollar on the gain?
And so the interesting conversation is that there's actually a forward policy setting document that comes out around taxation, and they had a quick look at it, and the number was something like $72 billion in foregone revenue in relation to capital gains tax exemptions, discounts, and negative gearing. So when you hear the words foregone revenue, that to me sounds like, well, hey, we really think that that's actually technically ours.
Yeah, that's the words to try and claim it back.
And so Dr. Jim Chalmers was on the radio in Melbourne on the morning of this particular thing and said, hey, we can't rule out getting rid of the capital gains tax exemption on principal place of residence. And by the afternoon, our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, had come out and said, oh, no, it'd be un-Australian to touch the family home. But he said nothing about the investment properties. So I think that by the time we get to the May budget, I think that we'll definitely see some change in policy settings. But can I say this to you, Theo? If you go down to Victoria, it has a completely different set of rules in relation to the provision of a rental property, which is all about safety. So gas and electricity and everything being tested, and all of those things are great. But the cost mechanisms associated with retrofitting, getting properties ready, getting them to the standard, that often people would maybe rent out a property that later on would be a future development site. So in other words, for a year or two, whilst they waited for the DA to go through council, which gave temporary supply. So a lot of those properties are now pulled from market as they, wait for the bulldozer, so to speak.
Sorry, why are they pulled from market?
Because they're not meeting the minimum requirements on the gas, electricity, safety requirements.
This is in New South Wales. I don't meet
Victoria.
Same as Victoria. Okay.
No, so Victoria is actually a much harsher setting than New South Wales.
Oh, it's harsher. So because I thought New South Wales is the one that gets a lot of scrutiny for being so.
Oh no, Victoria is absolutely much harsher in terms of being able to provide a rental property to market. Now, go and have a listen to this. So I'm in Los Angeles last week. We're doing work with our clients from the UK. And in the UK now they have a setting about literally the grading of the property of where it actually sits on its environmental stability. So in other words, it's CO2 emissions. And long story short, let's say it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G as an example of the measures. If your property does not meet a minimum of C within the course of 2030, you will not legally be able to lease it out. So the retrofitting associated with triple pane glass windows, changing of insulation, heating, cooling, all of those types of things is going to be substantial, and there's no government grants in play. So what you've got to realise is that it's fine for us, and they call it greenwashing, where there's a ton of policy associated with environmental, support, which is fantastic, a great outcome. But you actually have to realise the cost in doing that is going to be substantial. And so this is where. And where I think that the government's really got some issues, and regardless of who it is, if you have a look at it, the NDIS in Australia was supposed to be cost neutral, and it's $90 billion this year.
It's blown way out.
So where are you going to get that $90 billion from? Bang! I'll look at capital gains tax exemptions on investment properties, or have a conversation about land tax, or I'll do something.
And to your point, you can really going back on the specific wording of these politicians. It was the wording that caught my eye, which I found quite frustrating. Was recently with the changes in the superannuation concessions, and they say that it's costing taxpayers a certain amount for these people that are getting a 15% tax on superannuation beyond 3 million. It's not costing anyone anything. It's just the government sees that as an opportunity they can jump on. So you do need to be sort of on this wording and on these comments. That I think that was also Jim Chalmers leading that charge, wasn't it? Yeah.
So I think that the interesting conversation is that policy setting in Australia, where you've got a couple of things: rapid population growth, 30,000 students coming from China, which is all fantastic, because it's one of our greatest exports is education in Australia. Then followed closely by interest rates, changing government policy around provision of a property and what is safe and what is unsafe, in terms of that. Ecological sustainability that will soon come in, followed closely by the major collapse of such a large number of builders in Australia, the profitless building boom. And then the problem with once the property is being built, that it actually is not retailing. So we went, for example, to Dunedin in New Zealand. I feel New Zealand's about probably 6 months ahead of us in some ways. And there was to buy a section of land there was $500,000.
Sorry, just so I understand, what are you actually doing over in New Zealand?
So training, teaching real estate agents.
Just training.
Same thing again.
But you're getting hands on with their projects.
So and understand. So I said to them, tell me what's happened. So $500,000 for a block of land, $1 million to build it. The property owes you 1.5. So we've paid the extra because the builders were so much more expensive, 38% extra on material costs, all the above. Then we got to retail it in the market. We can't sell it for more than 1.2. And so that's what's about to happen in Australia, is that a number of these products that have been built in the last 6 months, 8 months, that are nearing completion shortly.
They don't stack.
That you've potentially helped fund, right, are now actually in a position that they're not going to retail back into the market because the consumer's like, hey, no, I just don't want to pay that. And so where we're really lucky is we've got net population growth. With the other thing that's also going to support a really strong Australian economy is that there's there's all these extra babies that have happened.
COVID boom.
So if you have a look at it, I think the number was, it was 30,000 in New Zealand, it's 100,000 in Australia, extra babies that have actually been born, that's actually helping population growth. So these are all really positive signs, but you actually need to understand, okay, great, well, a death rate is important, and so is a birth rate, but also too, what are we doing in terms of new supply? Now, there's ways that governments can handle this: density of development, opening up new corridors for development, proper conversations around funding, all of that.
Which is probably why, we've had some developers or project marketing agents in here in the past, and they've talked about that shift. Even Harry Triguboff is big on this, that shift towards Queensland for, firstly, sort of touching on what you're saying is happening in New Zealand, that development feasibility, that stack. So it's worthwhile doing so. But to your point about the regulation in Victoria and New South Wales, in Queensland, you can, correct me if I'm wrong, you can get away with a lot more, right?
The other thing is like government policy settings, like in particular like build to rent sector and what that looks like is a really interesting conversation. So the New Zealand government has a product which I think is 3 to 4 years ahead of the Australian version of it, which is called which is called Kiwi Build, and whatever the number was, let's say that they were going to build 10,000 homes over the 3 or 4 years of that policy. They built 1,000, but if you have a look at the number of the 1,000 they built, actually 800 of them they bought that were already established homes. So they only have actually built a net 200. And so the problem with a lot of these policy settings is that they sound really good, but you've actually got to get on the ground. You've got to go and build them. You can't go to Porter Davis because they're out of business. You can't go and have a conversation with certain builders across Australia because they're out of business. And so there's actually got to be a change to fixed price contracting and variable elements that are available in materials inside of building contracts in New South Wales. So when you become the Prime Minister, Theo, we've got a lot of things to change.
Well, they are sort of addressing some of these supply issues, you could say, by, let's say, there's 350,000 migrants coming in. They do have preferred jobs and whatnot that of these individuals and migrants coming in, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they are aimed toward the building sector and issues that we're lacking. So I think a lot in healthcare as well. You talk about the ageing population, a lot in that industry as well.
So all of that comes together, and you can change some policy settings. So say that there's a huge amount of capital that would love to come to Australia as an international conglomerate to actually come in and actually help to fund our build to rent sector. And we're just not doing that. What's also really topical in the UK is that I think we call them reverse mortgages here in Australia. Equity releases is what they're calling them in the UK. But that's definitely on the policy setting. Whereas here in Australia, I believe that the majors are kind of like, we don't want to touch that. It was a very distasteful product a few years ago, and we got ourselves into trouble.
I get both sides there. I've done those loans in the past myself. Reverse mortgages are probably the better terminology. Equity release can sort of refer to any consumer doing an equity release. They capitalise the interest onto the loan. The older you are, the more they'll lend you because the quicker they think that you're going to pass away.
And then if you live a little bit longer, you get into trouble, Theo. So.
Exactly right. If you're living too long is what the bank says. You got to go now. And it's I think it leaves a bit of a bad taste in the mouth of the next generation when they find out that mum and dad actually have no money at all.
And contrary to that, there's a book called Die with Zero, and it's all about how to live your life on your way through.
That's probably when you earn it the most, right? When you deserve it the most, I should say. In your later in life.
The biggest opportunity here, Theo, without a doubt, for real estate agents is that you've got to prospect and generate a ton of listing opportunities because more supply to market gives more choice. And what you've got to do, and what the greats do in our industry, is they bring forward future plans to today. So if you have a look at your life and, what is it going to look like? Well, Theo probably bought his first investment property, probably bought his first house. As life progresses, you buy your first family home, then you buy the better family home, and then from the better family home, then maybe you buy another investment property, then maybe you buy something to downsize into, and you're going to go through that life cycle. So maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 houses throughout the course of your life. What the government tried to do, particularly with like superannuation and the ability to be able to put $300,000 into your super, and if it's a husband and wife, can be up to $600,000 by selling a principal place of residence that you've owned for more than 10 years, as long as you've done it, you haven't done it before.
And you've got to do it within a certain time frame before retirement.
Yeah, then that's awesome because that sort of setting actually says, well, why do you need the big 5-bedroom home for a couple? You can now move into the beautiful townhome and do that, and that actually changes supply. So it's actually about encouraging people to move through the life cycles and move through property as that happens.
And that'd be good for the real estate agent to be across some of these policy changes so they can plant these seeds. I know in our work, in our client conversations, we plant a lot of seeds of tax concessions, tax breaks, benefits and whatnot to help people make decisions which aren't readily available in the sense that no one's really being proactive in teaching consumers these facts and benefits they're entitled to at certain periods of their property transacting journey.
Well, that actually came into in the budget into 2018. And so now it's here 2023. where that age changed and it came back down to 55. So from that point of view, what's really important is to keep abreast of those changes and to be aware. And I think that, you guys have done a great collaboration document, which Mel's been phenomenal at, which they try to update on a regular and consistent basis, just about what actually are the incentives that are currently available in market today, either at a federal or state level. And I believe that people can get a copy of that from you guys, which is fantastic. So it's a really important document to be across. And for, if you're providing advice or any advisory type services or awareness about them, so then they can go to talk to the appropriate financial advisors, that's a fantastic outcome.
So that's sort of covering a lot of the holistic things you're seeing, from a policy making point of view. What about let's go down to the front line. You're meeting with what? How many real estate agents probably per year at the moment?
So probably 6,000 to 7,000.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So, and that's internationally. So you're probably seeing a lot of the challenges that we're seeing locally here, you're probably seeing in other markets overseas, right? You touched on the fact that our cash rate is lower than our like-for-like, you could say, neighbours like New Zealand, the US and the UK. Whether we're going to see it get up to that level is a question mark, because I feel like we've tackled inflation sooner than they have, and we've seen some signs of things easing, which is probably the big changing thing that we've noted from previous podcasts. Inflation now consecutively decreasing since December. Unemployment didn't increase, which for some reason was bad news. They wanted unemployment to increase. And
well, the reason that they want that to increase is that brings down wages.
Of
and
course,
it brings down wages, that brings down the cost of provision of services.
And slows down the economy, which is the goal at the moment. So, but off these sort of the big agenda, let's talk about the front line. Let's talk about what are you seeing with these 7,000 real estate agents locally, internationally. We mentioned already that March had a increase in property prices across Australia as a whole. However, that is also directly correlated to, in my opinion, to a very low volume of stock. Confidence has probably increased come January. People that missed out last year is like, okay, now smart time to buy. I'm jumping in, and buyers are coming into the market, but they're fighting over a small pool of stock. What are you seeing? What are you forecasting? What are you hearing from all your people you work with?
So it's quite interesting. Seasonality is gone. So what you've got to realise is that we've got to understand that since mobile phones turned up, I don't know about you, Theo, but when you go on holidays, do you take your mobile?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so when you now go on holidays, do you realise your apps go on holidays with you? And like literally, and if you're spending time with friends and family, no doubt you probably have an extra, 20 minutes, an hour or something a day where all of a sudden you're on a mobile device.
And you're inquiring.
And so before you know it, you're actually doing it. So some of our best clients have really understood about how that social trend is actually changing the way that people go to work and operate. And the big conversation here is that what we're now seeing is that we've got a lot of people that are now launching properties on Boxing Day in Australia and having an auction event where they're selling those before the end of January. Now, previously in Australia, you wouldn't have sold a property between that period and potentially Australia Day. In New Zealand, it's Waitangi Day, which is first week of February. So the interesting conversation about that is that we don't see that. Now, at Easter, in Australia, a lot of real estate agents probably would have done it. April would be a very bumpy era because you've got 3-4 day work weeks, which doesn't work well. The Anzac Day period, that was on the Tuesday. The Monday, I reckon most Australians probably took it off. The Wednesday after that's my birthday. So it's a very big week for residential real estate agents, but so you remember. But that basic idea is to get you to think, well, hang on a second. That means that a lot of residential real estate agents will not list well in April, which means that there will be a substantially low level of stock in May. Which then means that that's going to put a lot of pressure on winter for June and July, unless you're good at what you do. And one of our clients up in Brisbane, actually, I was just speaking to him before we started today's podcast, they launched 80 properties on Easter Monday on the website. And they're in a position that those 80 properties will be sold at the end of April.
So, but wouldn't you also correlate that 3-4 day weeks over Easter and then Anzac Day? Wouldn't you also say then that's affecting the average consumer too? And, they're jamming all their 5 day worth of work into 3 days, and they don't have the headspace or the capacity, coupled with school holidays, to be out there shopping?
Do you know the number one day for selling cars in Australia?
Friday.
Boxing Day.
Boxing Day. Really?
Boxing Day sales, right?
Yeah, of course.
So when people are on holidays, spend cash, bro. When you're busy at work, don't have time to spend the cash. And so what you've got to realise is that consumers are changing. So what we're seeing on the front line, without a doubt, is that great real estate agents are very, very focused on process. The biggest difference that I've seen in our industry of those that really nail it and those that just go okay is that now they actually really understand that they're selling on value. And when they're selling on value, what do they need to do before, during and post the transaction to increase their value to Australian consumers when selling a residential property in Australia? We know that a consumer will pay more for a property where everything is already done for them. So there is no doubt that the best agents in the country are offering painting, mini renovation, full renovation, styling of a property before it goes live to market, retailing that property on market with the appropriate marketing methodology, whether or not that be auction or for sale, the appropriate online video content, all of the above. And then leading that into a position, most likely an auction if it's in a city environment, potentially for sale if it's a little more regional, depending on the locations, and then getting the property to settle in 30 or a 42-day time frame, 30 days in Victoria, 42 days here in New South Wales. That's a really big shift because now more than ever before, what you've got to realise that volumes are going to continue to change. And so why? Like, why is it there's certain amounts of properties that are available everywhere? Now, Louis Christopher did a phenomenal graph on this, where he actually has a look over the last 13 years. It was from 2010 to 23. And about, if you go and have a quick look at that number, and you break down the actual percentage, 50% of the stock in Australia has been on the market for more than 90 days, right? Then if you go and have a look at about 30% of the stock is less than 30.
It is across the whole of Australia.
Across all of Australia, so it's national, right? So the interesting conversation is if you have a look at the total number of listings that are available right now, it's about a third less than what's happened over the last 13 years. So what you're actually seeing is consumers going, hey, I'm not sure it's a great time to sell. I'm just going to wait this thing out.
Because why would you, with the media talking about how bad the property market is on a daily basis?
Well, if property prices are lower and I want to buy up, the one I want to buy should be less, the changeover cost should be less, the stamp duty costs are less, and the real estate agent's costs are less, is the argument.
If you're a confident property sort of transactor.
Well, I plan to live, so yeah, I'm going for it, right?
Yeah, but that's. I feel like I'm with you. I share that same view. If you're upsizing, the discount you get on the purchase should be outweighed by the discount you're taking on the sale.
As long as you've got income.
However, that takes a bullish, confident property sort of tycoon, almost, you could say. I wouldn't say tycoon, but
I wouldn't say I'm a tycoon.
But I feel like some people lack that confidence. They're worried. So
but here's the key thing: if you look at the AMP sentiment graph, there is no reason to be like that. Because if you go and you have a look about what's actually happened in the history of residential real estate, there is no doubt that. Look, so let's have a look. Have you ever seen that graph?
No, I don't even know there was an AMP sentiment graph.
So I'm going to show you that. But so what were interest rates in the late 80s, early 90s? High, 15, 16, 17%.
Yeah, early 80s
right?
was very high.
That came down, and then if you have a look at the average up until 1992 through to say circa 2008, the average was about 5%.
Exactly right.
Right?
Yep.
08, 09, 10, something happened, global financial crisis. As far as I'm aware, that tended to be where I believe that APRA came in play and that the buffer rate or the assessment rate was applied to the Australian mortgage industry. What that has now done is that then sees that the neutral rate sits at about 2.35% with the buffer rate on top of, say, 3. That's at 5.35%, which is what we actually had in the 20 years prior.
Yeah, so historically, yeah.
So from that point of view, what they're actually saying is that an interest rate or an official cash rate at 2.35% is neither stimulatory nor depressive in nature. So at 4.1%, if we go there shortly, as an example, that will be depressive in nature. It's designed to put more pressure on house pricing because I can borrow less. What will actually happen...
Which is their goal.
What will happen is that when interest rates start to decrease, and Bill Evans from Westpac, you put me onto the article, 7 interest rate reductions into 2025, getting it back to 2.35, that will not be an overstimulator, but it will start to get the market back to some level of normality. So that it can, if you sell it for this, you can also sell it for that in 3 months' time, right? And so it's neither down nor up. So 2.35 is our neutral rate. So let's get really confident about what the future looks like. Now, here's the key thing. If I go in today and I go to get a home loan at 5.6%, whatever the number is, you're going to add 3% on top of it. You're going to assess my ability to repay at 8.6. Now, I don't see interest rates going up to that amount. So from that point of view, it's a very safe mechanism to play. So get your own financial advice from your financial advisor. I'm not a financial advisor. You are, or your company certainly does. And what the whole conversation is to just get clear. If you have a genuine need in life, to have to increase the size of your home, you need to be in a particular school zone, you need to go and buy something because you wish to retire at some point in life, you got to do it. My dad rang me the other day. He said, Josh, I'm 71. I went to go and get an extra home loan the other day because he saw another property he'd like to add to his portfolio. Only needs 30% on the loan, right? So 70% equity or cash capable to put into the transaction. And the bank turned around to him and said, sorry, we can't lend to you anymore because you're too old. still has an income, still produces cash flow as a residential real estate sales agent.
Age is the roadblock.
But age is the roadblock. And he
Yeah.
said to me, he said, look, from someone who's speaking from a different section of the sunset versus the sunrise, while you can and whilst you're capable, you should do what you need to do. And that's it. That's you'll take your own advice from other people. But I can definitely tell you that I have the benefit at my current age of time on my side. And there is no doubt, and hence why I've spoken to you guys to make sure that I keep my funds available for what my approval in play and active, so that if I see the right asset that I can pounce.
You
Now,
can
it's
be ready to move.
annoying for you.
No,
'cause
no,
I
that's
keep
what
coming back every 90 days, but that whole conversation is a really important mechanism.
That's what we tell all our clients: just be ready for the opportunity. Don't wait for the opportunity and then try and do your paperwork, because you'll miss out.
Yeah.
So let's just go back again to that point that you're sort of alluding to. So, effectively, or essentially, I should say, we've got a very elevated cash rate, which we might see one or two more rises to come, but we're probably peaking at cash rate, the forecast of cash rate. And then, like you touched on, Bill Evans is forecasting, and Bill Evans being the chief economist of Westpac, and most of the major bank economists are forecasting that the cash rate will start coming down. They were saying start of next year. Some are now saying the end of this year. And the global futures market and bonds market's also forecasting rates to come back down this year rather than next year, with up to 7 cuts to come back down toward that historical average of about 2.35% cash rate. So, the wise purchaser, the smart money, can see an opportunity on the table right now where people walking into their bank, they're having to calculate their affordability off the APRA force guidelines of an interest rate of 8%, meaning borrowing powers are crippled. You can't actually go into a bank and borrow as much as you used to through the COVID boom of 2020, 2021. So your competition at these auctions and open homes that you're inspecting is weak. Plus, people do, regardless of what the affordability of the APRA and the banking regulator is, people are actually doing their affordability on today's repayments. So we're seeing it ourselves. We're seeing people calculate, okay, well, wow, I was thinking about buying a property for this price, but if the repayments are X, maybe I can't. Maybe I need to find something that's a little bit cheaper, despite these forecasts, right?
So it's bizarre because you gave me an incredible chart. I had the opportunity to ring you guys and said, hey, can I just find out how much money could Josh have borrowed when the cash rate was at 0.1%? And let's call this a fictitious character, Josh. It wasn't actually me. And so, Josh, you can go out and I think it was Macquarie was the example that I can remember because it was at the top of the chart. So it was $1,089,000 when it was at 0.1. All of a sudden, that's come down. And that particular person now at 3.6 is roughly 711. So $1,089,000 down to 711 is $370,000 reduction. 370,000 over $1,089,000, let's roughly call it 35%. So my borrowing capacity has dropped by 35%.
Yep.
That's expected to hit 650 if it goes to 4.1, right? That's roughly where my numbers are. So I go $1,089,000 down to 650. That's that's 400-ish, 400-ish over $1,000,000. That's 40% roughly.
40%. Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I can then only borrow 650,000, and Bill Evans is right, if he is, and it gets to 2.35, all of a sudden I'm going to go back up in terms of my borrowing capacity to 850,000. That increase is 200 grand. 200 grand over the 650 is about, let's call it 27% increase in my borrowing capacity. So think, how can prices not recover if you have a 27% increase in borrowing capacity when the weakest moment is most likely in the course of this next 90 days of market cycle? If everything that we believe is going to happen is going to happen.
And I feel like that message is starting to become the well-known sort of message that's being digested in consumers and buyers on the front line, because like I said, property prices have started to increase, confidence is back, open homes are getting big numbers again.
I'm a bit cheeky. I say, look, Theo, would you spend an extra $8,000 or $9,000 in interest expense over the next 12 to 18 months to potentially write up a capital growth of 100 grand?
Yeah, exactly.
So would you spend 10 to make 100?
Yeah.
And they go, yeah, I would. No, please seek your own financial advice from your own financial advisor. But that's the basic conversation is about, putting things into perspective and giving people insights. Now, I am from a regional area. I bought my first house for $142,500.
Wow, with a bag of rice.
No, it wasn't a bag of rice. It was a couple of goats. But the basic idea was that and at the time, I think that the mortgage was like $600 a month. And I was trying to figure out how I was going to go and pay the $600. And I can tell you now that had just the same amount of stress as I have today in owning the property that I own now. And it's that same conversation, right? Is that like, it's never cheap. You're never going to get a deal. You got to ride the mark of time. And the interesting conversation is that, you got to start to, buy assets that you actually really love, that you can see potential in.
It's funny. That's a really good point. And it reminded me of a ABC video that circulated online recently. I'm not sure if you saw it, but it was a news reporter interviewing a bunch
Canberra?
in Canberra in the 70s, I think it was. A bunch of people coming out of the auction room in Canberra and bidding on empty lots of land. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think they were going for $2,700.
Yeah.
And they were disappointed that they were selling for so much. Their budget was like early 2000, like 2,200. And they just said, it's just ridiculous what people are paying for these blocks of land. And it was the same type of hysteria and comments they were saying, in the sense that, I think there's just too much demand and not enough supply at the moment. We're going to wait it out, see what changes. There's been the same comments for 4 decades.
Yeah. Well, I think that perspective is a really interesting thing. What you've got to realise is that I actually think inflation's here to stay. I'm contrary to most people. The 60-year trend of globalisation and moving all production to China is because China became phenomenal at manufacturing. Unbelievable around what they did in that era. What we're now seeing is that there's a new policy setting where people are going, hey, maybe that's not such a smart idea if a country gets locked down with another freak, weird COVID-type scenario. So you now see the majors, for example, Apple and Ford Motor Co. as an example, saying we just don't want production plants in China. We also want one in Vietnam. We also want another one in Mexico. We also want another one in the US. And so now we're going to go into decentralization of that production. That's going to take 6 years. So effectively, we're going to reverse a 60-year global trend over the course of the next 6 years. We are still going to have significant supply constraints that will drive inflation continually. So from that perspective, what is really important to understand, it's not like all of this stuff is just going to be fixed by June.
No.
And that's the thing that I'm saying to people, is that when I say it's a slow recovery, please understand those words. It's a slow recovery. If you're buying for a 3 to 5 to 10 year hold, personally, that's what I'm doing personally for myself, because I think that that's the right timing for me. Now, that could be very different for different people in their own circumstances, which is why they need professional financial advice. But it is a really important mechanism to understand that the foundations are strong. Strong population growth, huge amount of rental demand, lots and lots of restriction in supply, not many builders building new developments from this point forward, a significant supply of development sites now currently available for sale because they won't be proceeding with the building.
Because the feasibilities don't stack.
Yep, and so that's actually going to cause us to actually speed into the recovery a lot quicker than many had thought.
That's another, you've touched on so many points. I wanted to dive in and open up there, but just one more on that point on building sort of approvals and developers and whatnot. So yes, developments have slowed down. Supply of new housing is pretty much a third of what it was about 4 years ago, right? The other sort of hysteria, if I have to use that word again, around building costs going through the roof, actually it's now going the other way because people have been so scared by, all these bad experiences, I should say, from a friend or a colleague at work or whatever they see on TV or online about, building costs blowing out and the builder walking off site or going broke or something along those lines. Now, no one wants to build. And across New South Wales, I read that DA application volumes have decreased by about 35% on all local councils. And we're already seeing building. Now, what's funny about building costs is that because we had such huge amounts of demand, a lot of these wholesalers had to increase supply and they've imported all these materials or manufactured, whatever it may be, and now they have an oversupply because demand has all of a sudden disappeared. I wouldn't say disappeared, but it started to ease. And so now already, apparently across the board, we're seeing about a 20 to 30% decrease off the COVID peak in building material prices. Still not back to pre-COVID levels, and I don't think we'll see pre-COVID levels again, but we're already starting to see building costs come down. So for a lot of those people that are hesitant, I think it's actually not a bad time to shop around if you were looking at proceeding on a construction or looking at buying a house with a new build, because I know a lot of our building clients or clients that are architects and whatnot in that space, they've got builders calling up the architects saying, hey, do you have any new jobs coming on? Because my current pipeline finishes in the next few months, and I've got nothing after that.
Mm-hmm.
And normally they have a pipeline of jobs, 2-3 houses at once.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting times.
My dad would always say, and I'm very lucky to have him as a great mentor and teacher, but he would say to me, the intrinsic value is in the land, and they never make more of it. And so from that point of view, if you have a look at the size of the Australian lot size over the last 20 years, it's kind of gone from 800 square metres in a new development to now around 220 square metres.
For land?
Still the same price point.
Really?
So the price point on a block out of Melbourne is, say, 350 grand to go and buy a block of land to go and build. But the size of that block has gone from that 800 to 220 square metres.
I didn't know that. So 220 is the average?
Yeah.
So I thought 375 is the going norm around New South Wales, right?
So that was an out of Melbourne scenario, and the guy who sells a lot of these in Globo parcels, he goes, mate, that's actually the problem. So you've got a federal government who says, hey, we want to increase supply, but then the state government in Victoria have got a windfall gains tax that if you're developing land, you pay 50% to the government. So hang on a second. I thought we were trying to increase supply, but now we've got to. So this is the problem. I think that you need a balanced scorecard. The way that I've always been taught to look at property: can I fundamentally improve the quality of the asset? Can I do something with the land in terms of development and changing its availability, residential, commercial, density of development? And is it something that I can live in? Is it something that I'd love to own for many generations? And we would have those rules. And if it hit the 4 out of the 4, then Dad would let us buy them. And that was the conversation.
It sounds like you're more of a property tycoon than a real estate coach there, Josh. It sounds like you should be leading some sort of these property seminars instead.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is I love property, and I love property because of its intrinsic nature, that it improves in capital value and you can always rent it out. I know that shelter is one of the great human needs, and naturally we should be in a position that we're looking for provision. I think that it's about unlocking capital and creating policy and framework that actually encourages people to be able to build for their retirement as opposed to not. Now, I had an interesting conversation the other day. If you're in the top marginal tax rate in Australia, let's roughly call it 50% to keep the numbers simple. But you're okay, great. I work Monday and half day Tuesday to pay for my the wages and the operational costs inside of my business. I work the other half of Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday to pay for tax. On Friday mornings, I pay for any additionals that might happen in the business, and I actually work for myself on Friday afternoon. And that's how the Australian taxation system's actually set up. And so when you start to think about it that way, you want to hope I'm not sick on Friday, Arvo. but it's a really interesting conversation that that you've got to, I believe you've got to encourage people that actually have ability to be able to contribute to society and to be able to provide a nest egg and support for those that are vulnerable. And the vulnerable in those society are those, and I tend to think about it this way, those that are unable to look after themselves, the young, the very old, and those people that have got a disability. And I believe that we do have a significant role to play in society to look after those people that can't look after themselves.
100%, yeah.
But at the same time too, we also have a really important thing to encourage people. I don't ever plan to get the pension. I plan ideally to be in a position I've got enough property to have enough income coming in so I can live a nice life and not have to worry.
You're probably going to be one of those people that's getting affected by this new 3 mil
threshold,
possibly,
right? yeah. But land tax and all of those things. But it's about really understanding that, you got to go for it and you got to make that decision. Navigate all of the things that we've spoken about. The foundations are seriously strong in residential real estate, population growth, the conversation around lack of supply, knowing that ultimately there's a huge number of people that are coming for universities, all of those things. I genuinely don't think you could have picked a better time to get to the bottom of this particular current cycle, purely based on the numbers that we're seeing. And that as we get ready for the slow recovery coming out, whether you buy today or whether or not you buy in October probably doesn't matter. But what I do know, that you should be getting involved in a transaction is my personal opinion to self. That's how I talk to myself, because I know that if I get involved in a transaction, then in 5, 10 or 15 years, away we go. And ultimately, the greatest wealth that you ever build tends to be through capital growth or development of property. And that's what I've seen.
And especially in your home, which is a tax-free environment. Well, there you have it, guys. Josh Phegan. I think we might. I wouldn't be surprised if we see you end up later in career in politics there with some of those ambitions and feelings and emotions you have towards policy.
Mark Benioff from Salesforce says that business is actually the greatest opportunity to make change happen. And I think that you'll see me firmly stay in business.
Okay, that's good to know. All right, well, guys, if you want to get any more information from Josh, you can contact him directly. He's traveling the whole world preaching his messages and teaching the real estate industry, like I mentioned. Josh, thank you so much for coming on board. Really appreciate your time. And hopefully we'll have you again soon.
Well, Theo, what I can definitely say, the experiences that I've had and the opportunity to be able to work with you in a very short period of time has been transformative, and it's been a really amazing opportunity to be able to work with people of your calibre. I don't say that lightly, but the speed at which we were able to put a transaction together, the quality of that transaction, the people that were around that transaction was really amazing to watch. And I think that you're doing an amazing thing. So congratulations on all your success.
Thanks, Josh. That's a good wrap. We needed that one. Yeah, it's with 6,000 to 7,000 real estate agents potentially listening to you. Hopefully that message gets out there too.
No problem. Sounds good. Thanks, Theo.
All right. Thanks, guys.